House had been quiet for 3 years, the kind of quiet that settles in after someone leaves and never comes back. I'd learned to make tea for one. I'd learned to sleep in the middle of the bed. I'd learned a lot of things after my husband passed, and most of them were harder than I'd expected. But none of them prepared me for the afternoon my son walked through my front door without knocking and dropped a manila envelope on my kitchen table like it was already his. I'm 68 years old. I live in a two-story house in Oakville, Ontario, the same house where I raised my children, where I planted the cedar hedge along the back fence, where my husband proposed to me in the kitchen doorway because he said it was the warmest room in the house. I taught high school English for 31 years. I am not a woman who loses her mind. I am not a woman who forgets things, and I am certainly not a woman who signs documents she hasn't read. But my son had begun speaking to me as though I were all three. It started small, the way these things do. A phone call checking whether I'd taken my blood pressure medication. A comment at Sunday dinner about whether I should still be driving in winter. My daughter-in-law asking, in that carefully measured voice she uses when she's already decided something, whether I'd thought about downsizing, not suggesting, not offering, asking in a way that assumed the answer. I noticed. I always noticed. I just didn't say anything yet. My son is 42. He works in commercial real estate in Toronto, which means he understands the value of things and very little about what makes them worth keeping. His wife is charming at Christmas and efficient the rest of the year. They have a mortgage that stretches them thin, two kids in private school, and a lifestyle that costs more than either of them earns comfortably. I knew this not because they told me, but because I'm their mother and I've been watching their faces at family dinners for decades. The envelope sat on my kitchen table. I put my hands around my mug and looked at it. "What is this?" I asked. My son sat down across from me like he was settling in for a reasonable conversation. He had his father's jawline and none of his father's patience for dishonesty. "It's just some paperwork," he said, "about the house and your finances. It would make things so much easier, Mom. If something happened to you, we'd be able to handle things without going through probate. It just makes sense." I asked him what kind of paperwork. He said it was a power of attorney. I said I'd like to read it before I signed anything. He said there wasn't much to read. It was standard. His colleague had drafted it. I asked which colleague. He said someone from his office. I asked whether that person was a lawyer. He said it didn't need to be a lawyer. It was just a standard form. I looked at the envelope again. I looked at my son. "I think I'd like my own lawyer to look at this," I said. The shift in his expression was small, but I caught it. Something tightened around his eyes. He reached over and put his hand on mine the way you do when you're about to explain something to someone who doesn't quite understand. "Mom, you don't need a lawyer. It's just paperwork. I'm your son." I nodded. I said I'd think about it. He left the envelope on the table. I left it there for 2 days without touching it, not because I was afraid of it, because I wanted him to think I was. I want to tell you something about getting older that nobody tells you when you're young. People start talking around you instead of to you. They start making plans that include you without consulting you. They lower their voices when they think you might be worried, which is another way of saying they lie to you with good intentions. And sometimes, not always, but sometimes the people who love you most are the ones who do it worst, because they've already decided what's best for you and they're just waiting for you to agree. I had no intention of agreeing. The morning after my son's visit, before I even finished my first cup of coffee, I called my family lawyer. I've used the same firm in Burlington for 18 years. My lawyer is a woman named Claire, sharp and practical and not given to unnecessary words. I told her my son had left documents on my table asking for a general power of attorney, drafted by someone in his real estate office, unsigned. She was quiet for a moment. "Don't sign anything," she said. I told her I had no plans to. She asked if I could come in. I said I could come in that afternoon. What happened next happened quietly and over the course of 3 weeks, which is not the way these things happen in films, but exactly the way they happen in real life. Claire reviewed the documents my son had left. She told me they were not what he described. The power of attorney being requested was broad and immediate. It would have given my son full authority over my finances, my property decisions, and certain aspects of my health care, effective upon signing, no medical assessment required. There was no expiry. There was no limitation. There was no limitation. There was no co-signatory to provide oversight. This would have given him the ability to sell your home, Claire said, without your further involvement. I sat in her office with my hands folded in my lap and I listened. Then I asked her what I needed to do. Here is what I did not do. I did not call my son and confront him. I did not tell my daughter-in-law what I'd found. I did not cry about it, though there was one evening, a Tuesday, when I sat in my husband's old reading chair and felt a kind of grief I don't have a name for. Not for the house, not really. For the version of my son I'd believed in. For the years I'd spent trusting that the people I loved would love me the same way back. I gave myself that Tuesday evening. Wednesday morning I got back to work. Claire helped me draft an updated will. We reviewed my existing power of attorney documents, which I had in fact already completed years ago properly, with a different family member named as decision maker. We confirmed my financial accounts and the house title were properly structured. I contacted my financial advisor at the credit union and had a thorough review of all my accounts. Everything was in order. Everything was mine. I also called my daughter. She lives in Halifax, works as a registered nurse, calls me every Sunday without fail. She's the child I don't worry about. I told her what was happening. She was quiet in a way that meant she was choosing her words carefully. Then she said, "Mom, do you want me to be there?" I told her I would let her know. My son called twice during those 3 weeks. Once to check in, he said. Once to ask about the paperwork very casually as if it had just occurred to him to ask. I told him I was still thinking about it. I was pleasant. I was warm. I offered nothing. The meeting he'd requested, the one where we were going to sit down as a family and go through everything together, was scheduled for a Saturday afternoon. He and his wife would drive out from Toronto. He'd mentioned bringing someone from his office to help walk me through the documents. I said that sounded fine. I said I was looking forward to it. I also called Claire and asked her to be there. Then I called a second lawyer from her firm, a man who specializes in elder law and capacity assessments, and the specific ways families sometimes fail their older members. I told Claire I wanted both of them present. She said she'd arrange it. The Saturday came gray and cold, the kind of March day that Ontario does particularly well, all low cloud and old snow going brown at the edges. I made coffee. I put out a plate of shortbread because I was raised to be hospitable even when I am furious. My son arrived at 1 o'clock with his wife and a man I didn't recognize who carried a briefcase and didn't make eye contact. They came in and settled at the dining room table. The stranger with the briefcase began to arrange papers. My son put his hand on my arm and said it was good to do this. It was the responsible thing. He was glad I'd agreed to sit down and talk it through. I said I was glad too. Then I went to the front door and opened it. Claire walked in first. The elder law specialist walked in behind her. They both carried their own files. They were both dressed for a formal meeting. My son's face went very still. I looked at him from across the room, and I said, very calmly, "You mentioned I didn't need a lawyer. I thought it would be a good idea to get a second opinion on that." The man with the briefcase looked at my son. My son looked at the lawyers. His wife looked at the table. Claire put her files down and said she had a few questions about the documents currently in front of her. The elder law specialist said he had some questions as well, particularly regarding the scope of the requested authority and whether I had been provided with independent legal advice before being asked to sign. The man with the briefcase said he was just there to help explain things. Claire said she was sure that was true and asked for his full name in the name of his firm. The meeting that was supposed to take 2 hours and end with my signature took 40 minutes and ended with nothing signed and a lot of silence. The man with the briefcase left first. My daughter-in-law said she needed some air and didn't come back in. My son stayed at the table for a while after the lawyer stepped into the hallway. He looked at me. I thought he might say something real, something that cracked through the planning and the strategy and got to whatever was underneath it. He said, "I was trying to look out for you." I said, "I know you believe that." He left without finishing his coffee. I heard his car back out of the driveway, and then the street was quiet again. Claire and the other lawyer sat with me for another half hour. We went through a few things, confirmed my updated documents were in order, talked about what next steps I wanted to take and which I didn't. I told them I wasn't interested in pursuing anything formal. I was interested in my son understanding clearly that I had made decisions and that those decisions were final and legally sound and not available for renegotiation. They said they could help me communicate that if I needed them to. I said I thought I could manage it on my own. My daughter flew in from Halifax the following weekend. She didn't ask me to explain everything again. She just showed up with groceries and spent Saturday helping me reorganize the basement, which had needed doing for 2 years. We had dinner at the kitchen table, and she told me about her patients, and I told her about the book I was reading, and neither of us mentioned her brother more than once. That once she said, "Mom, are you okay?" I said I was more okay than I'd been in a while, actually, which was the truth. My son and I have spoken twice since March. The conversations were careful and surface level, and I expect they will be for some time. There is grief in that. I won't pretend otherwise. He is still my child. I still remember the way he used to fall asleep in the car on the way home from his hockey games when he was small. Helmet still on, mouth open, completely trusting. I kept that memory and I keep it still. But I also know now what I perhaps only suspected before, that love without respect is not the kind of love that protects you. It's the kind that decides things on your behalf. And I am 68 years old. I have a will, a lawyer, a financial plan, and a daughter who calls every Sunday. Nobody decides things on my behalf. In April, I signed up for a woodworking class at the community center in Oakville. My husband had always been the one who built things. It seemed like time for me to learn. The instructor is a retired contractor named Gerald who teaches Tuesdays and has no patience for excuses, and somehow reminds me of every good teacher I ever worked alongside. I'm making a side table. It's crooked, and I've sanded it 3 times, and I'm not finished yet. But I will be. And when I'm done, I'm going to put it right next to my husband's old reading chair in the warmest room in the house, which is still mine. What I keep coming back to months later is that envelope sitting on my kitchen table. I didn't touch it for 2 days. People might read that as hesitation. It wasn't. It was the clearest decision I'd made in years. There's something that happens when someone mistakes your calm for confusion. They take it as permission to keep going. My son saw a 68-year-old woman alone in a big house, and he drew conclusions about what she needed. He wasn't entirely wrong about the facts. I am 68. I do live alone. The house is too big for one person in the practical sense. But he was completely wrong about what those facts meant, and that gap between what he assumed and what was actually true. That's where everything unraveled for him. I've thought a lot about what made the difference, not just in how things turned out, but in how I was able to stay steady through it. Part of it was simply knowing my own mind. I taught high school for 31 years. I marked papers. I managed classrooms full of teenagers who tested every boundary they could find. I learned a long time ago that the people who shout the loudest about what you need are usually the ones who haven't asked. My son never asked. He presented. There's a difference, and I think if he's honest with himself, he knows it. But knowing your own mind isn't enough on its own. You also have to be willing to act on it. That's the part that surprised even me a little. Because it would have been easier not to. It would have been easier to sign the papers and keep the peace and tell myself I was being practical. A lot of women my age do exactly that. Not because they're weak. Because they're tired, and because the cost of fighting feels higher than the cost of giving in. I understand that completely. I just wasn't willing to pay it. Claire made it easier. Having someone competent and clear-eyed in my corner reminded me that preparation is not paranoia. Going into that Saturday meeting with 2 lawyers wasn't aggression, it was just accuracy. I knew what the situation actually was, and I arranged myself accordingly. My son walked in expecting to manage a conversation. He walked into something else entirely. I don't think he's a bad person. I think he made a series of choices that grew from a small dishonesty. The kind where you convince yourself you're helping someone while quietly helping yourself at the same time. That particular self-deception has a way of compounding. One small justification leads to another until you're sitting at your mother's dining room table with a stranger's briefcase and a document you described as just paperwork. What I hope he takes from it eventually is that respect isn't something you set aside when it becomes inconvenient. It's not a courtesy you extend to people when you agree with their decisions. It's what you owe them regardless. His father knew that. I tried to teach it. Maybe this was the lesson that finally landed. The woodworking class is still going. The side table is still going. The side table is still crooked. Gerald told me last Tuesday that the best furniture has character and that perfection is for people with nothing interesting to say. I think he might be right about that. I'm gonna finish it anyway, and it's going to sit in the warmest room in the house. And every time I look at it, I'll remember that 68 is not the end of anything.